I had learned all I needed to do basic HTML, and I thought, okay, I know what I need to know, and now I'm going to create websites for Ariana and see where it takes me. With less than a formidable arsenal, I was about to become a website designer. I'd be working out of Ariana's house in Brentwood, not far from my apartment in Santa Monica. It fit my lifestyle all the way down to the bizarre and cloistered office she provided for me, which was hidden behind a huge painting. It was like a secret panic room situated above her office, accessible only by a spiral staircase, and which itself looked just like an old English study in the board game Clue. The first day on the job, I went into her office and she sat me in front of her desk. She handed me a piece of paper that said on the top, Director of Research. It had a small list of job requirements. I asked, "What is this?" She countered, "Which of these things can you do?" I didn't get it. "You want me to find somebody to become your researcher? Just tell me what you can do on this list." The first requirement was the ability to type. "I'm a hunt and pecker." She said, "That's okay." Requirement 2, ability to write. "Okay," I said. "I wrote for my college paper and a couple of local entertainment magazines." "Yes, darling, perfect." Requirement 3 was the ability to edit. I guess," I said. "I mean, I don't know those weird book editor symbols, but I know basic grammar." At this point, I was getting a little confused. I'd signed up to create websites for a rich conservative columnist and speaker, an easy job, and now this was feeling like a bait-and-switch. But before my confusion could turn into anger, I saw requirement 4. Do you know how to use LexisNexis? And it hit me between the eyes that for all of my stumbling and bumbling, I had tripped over the perfect job for an internet information junkie. LexisNexis was the key to satiating my cravings. A database aggregating virtually every article in the modern history of media, both mainstream and obscure. For a person organizing bookmarks of every newspaper who wanted to find every piece of information that was out there, LexisNexis was the holy grail. This was before Google, and you can find a lot on Google today, but even now, LexisNexis is the greatest thing in the world, and having access to it was a dream come true. I'd never felt so good to be duped in my life. At 27, gulp, I felt like I might actually have the first job I wanted to keep. Then it got even better. Ariana next informed me that there was a story she was working on and that the source of the story was staying in her house while she wrote the piece. The source's name was Norma Nichols, and she was the personal secretary to a man named M. Larry Lawrence. Larry Lawrence was the owner of the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego, and he became the top donor to Bill Clinton. He was therefore rewarded with the ambassadorship to Switzerland. From 1991 to 1996, Lawrence gave $200,000 to Democrats. At the time, the world was just finding out the list of favors the Clinton White House was paying out for high-end donors, including overnight stays in the Lincoln bedroom. A cursory investigation into Lawrence's background showed that he had some suspect business relations in Detroit. Already I was getting excited. This was fun, interesting. The layers of intrigue to the story involved sex, politics, and Bill Clinton, one of my personal chosen online investigative obsessions. When Larry Lawrence died of cancer in 1996, Bill Clinton provided him a waiver to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was the first merchant marine to be given this sacred honor. In the 1990s, Larry and his fourth wife, Sheila, had spent a lot of their time running around to merchant marine and Clinton fundraisers, giving their money and hoping to get goodies back in return. Goodies, apparently, like being buried in Arlington National Cemetery, sacred land. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was that Larry Lawrence wasn't even a merchant marine. Norma Nichols told Ariana that back in the early 1990s, Lawrence asked her to research the history of the Merchant Marine at a San Diego library. Then, Nichols said, Lawrence started writing checks to the Merchant Marine. All of a sudden, the Merchant Marine started giving him awards because he was giving them money. He started claiming that he had served aboard the USS Horace Bushnell, a Merchant Marine ship torpedoed during World War II, and that he had been thrown into the Arctic Ocean as the ship sank. And Ariana was onto both scams. Clinton's culpability in selling an Arlington burial slot and Lawrence's culpability in falsifying a pseudo-military record in order to gain entrance. On November 24, 1997, Ariana started revealing the story to Americans. The more we delve into Larry Lawrence's last years, the more he looks like the poster child of President Clinton's Make-A-Wish Foundation for big-time donors. Lawrence's only military link was his service in the Merchant Marine during World War II. I was surprised and disturbed, Norma Nichols, his executive assistant from 1979 to 1993, told me, to learn that Larry was allowed to be buried at Arlington. I was a Navy officer's wife for 24 years who lost many good friends in the Vietnam War. I believe that should be a privilege accorded only to those who have given up something for their country. I worked as his personal assistant for almost 15 years before he was appointed ambassador to Switzerland, and as far as I know, he never expressed a desire to have a military funeral. It appears that the driving force behind the effort to bury Lawrence at Arlington was his fourth wife, whose petit bourgeois appetite for honors and distinctions seems to have no limit. Whatever the truth about his Merchant Marine service, can anything other than political services rendered explain multiple medal winners standing in line awaiting admittance to Arlington while Lawrence is allowed to cut ahead? Way ahead. The response was swift and brutal from the mainstream media. Maureen Dowd, a charter member, ripped Ariana, writing in her syndicated column, "The Clintonites have hidden behind double talk so often it was tempting to believe the Republicans' sinister allegations. But the GOP case began to melt. What you need to know about the Republicans is that the charge was disgusting." White House Special Counsel Lanny Davis told the press that Lawrence was thrown overboard and suffered a serious head injury. Had he been in the Navy and the same incident would have occurred, he would have received a Purple Heart. The late Richard Holbrooke, former Assistant Secretary of State, said, "I'm dumbfounded that there would be the slightest question about the appropriateness of Larry Lawrence being buried at Arlington." Army Secretary Togo West said there was no political motivation to Lawrence's burial. "I am the responsible person. Just not done. Not possible. He deserves to be there." But Ariana was just getting started. She was responding to attacks on her credibility with calm and composure, knowing that she had the goods, and reacting with utter serenity as she watched a phalanx of media swarm around her looking for their pound of flesh. She fed them the story, bit by bit, and I was helping. There was a moment in my research when I personally realized that everything Ariana was saying was true. I was spelunking, and finally I came across something big. I ran down to Ariana's office yelling, "Ariana! Ariana! He didn't serve in the Merchant Marines, I'm positive." It was a piece from the San Diego Union Tribune dated January 19, 1993. The story talked about how Lawrence had been honored by the Merchant Marine at a dinner, where he had recalled the morning when, as an 18-year-old, he suffered head wounds during a German torpedo attack on his ship in the frigid waters off Murmansk. There was only one problem. According to the newspaper, the incident was previously unknown to most of his family and close friends. To me, that was the whole goods. It was the confirmation in my mind that everything Ariana was laying out for the American public was true. Ariana ran with it. Citing that piece and responding to her critics, she wrote, "What about the fact that the Horace Bushnell's manifest does not include Lawrence's name, or the fact that the casualty list for the ship also has no record of the injuries so movingly described by the White House counsel? Indeed, according to the Maritime Administration, and the U.S. Coast Guard, there is no record of Lawrence having served in the Merchant Marine at all. The house of cards that the complex constructed for Larry Lawrence began to crumble. The same media that had attacked Ariana now began to swing behind her, calling for Lawrence's disinterment from Arlington. Folks like Sam Donaldson, Cokie Roberts, George Stephanopoulos, and yes, Maureen Dowd. All I could say as I watched it was 3 words. This is awesome. The awesomeness culminated on a Thursday morning in December. I was working in my hidden office when I heard Ariana shouting, "Come down, come down, come down." I came downstairs and she pointed at the TV and shouted, "Watch." CNN was on, and it was showing aerial helicopter footage of Arlington National Cemetery, where a series of banquet tents formed a labyrinthine path to the exit of Arlington. They were disinterring Larry Lawrence at the behest of Sheila Lawrence, Larry Lawrence's aforementioned 4th wife, who, along with Clinton's liberal media allies, had shot at Ariana without aiming first in an attempt to smear her. They had instinctively defended Larry Lawrence. They had put their names and credibility out there, and when caught red-handed, none of them had ever apologized. But it didn't matter. Ariana was staring at the TV with a look of utter serenity on her face. She'd gotten her scalp. I knew right then and there that I needed to find a way to do this for a living. One night, in late December 1997, I watched an episode of Nightline. The subject? Matt Drudge. The premise? An entire hour about Matt Drudge. They started with this. "Do you know who this man is?" A picture of Drudge at his computer flashed on the screen. Type, type, type. "If you don't, you soon will." The show actually went on in a semi-positive vein, as positive as you can get for a conservative with a few scalps, a conservative who is trailblazing against the complex. They had the requisite slams, of course, posting a picture of Drudge's website next to pictures of extreme websites, implying that the internet was filled with crazies and white supremacists, but for the most part it was fair. Little did I know that ABC News was foreshadowing something much greater than Kathleen Willey or the death of Princess Diana. They were foreshadowing the demolition of a presidency. In January 1998, I was a happy guy. I was happily married, living in a tiny house with, I swear, a white picket fence. I had my buddies, Ariana and Matt, and we were all hanging out together, and we were all doing more from Los Angeles with minimal resources than the mainstream media were doing from Washington, D.C. with hundreds of reporters. It was great fun. About 2 weeks after the New Year, on January 16th, 1998, I spent the day at home, paying attention to the unprecedented deposition Bill Clinton was giving due to his former student, Judge Susan Weber Wright, ruling that he had to testify in Paula Jones's civil lawsuit. For me, as a Clinton aficionado, this was a huge day. A sitting president testifying about accusations of sexual harassment. Now, I was against overly broad sexual harassment law on a philosophical level because of my belief that feminism had defined sexual harassment down to the type of interaction that created so many marriages, a secretary and a boss meeting each other at work, for instance. I didn't believe in the post-structural, PC Marxist feminist critique that said that sexual relationships were inherently relationships between the oppressor and the oppressed, and that power structures between bosses and employees necessarily rendered such relationships a form of sexual harassment. I thought that was nonsense, which is why Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings had been such an epiphany for me. But at the same time, I knew that if they were going to hold Thomas to that standard, they had to hold Clinton to that standard as well. The Clinton hearings became, to me, the living embodiment of the Democrat media complex, and the inherent biases of the media were multiplied when cable news came of age during this era. With an enormous dedication of resources, the complex went to work spinning Bill Clinton out of peril. Watching a purported women's rights advocate get away with sexual harassment, shoving cigars in the help, groping job applicants in the hallways, was the emblematic example of the media double standard, where a liberal could get away with anything as long as he towed the politically correct line. Clinton could attack women, use his gun-toting state troopers to recruit hand-picked groupies for him as if he were a rock star, pull down his pants and say, "Kiss it." He could get away with it because he was a liberal and because liberals wanted him to get away with it. I wanted Clinton to pay, and I wanted his enablers to pay. I wanted to see them held to the standard that they had created to destroy their enemies. I wanted Clinton to get busted because it was obvious to me that this was the type of person you would not let your daughter date, your sister date, any distant relative date. That this was a guy who was not virtuous, that he was a glutton, that he had a voracious appetite for power and women and food and anything that he could use to fill himself up. As a human being, he was essentially a sociopath, but the mainstream media had built him up because he possessed weapons that suited their purpose, the correct pro-abortion and left-of-center economics policies, the wily charms of a born cad, and a venal commitment to the politics of personal destruction. After watching the hearings at around midnight, I got home and started to climb into bed. Before I did, I logged onto the internet. In my email box was the Drudge Report. Newsweek kills story on White House intern, the all-caps headline bannered. Blockbuster report, 23-year-old former White House intern, sex relationship with president. At the last minute, at 6 p.m. on Saturday evening, Newsweek magazine killed a story that was destined to shake official Washington to its foundation. A White House intern carried on a sexual affair with the President of the United States. The Drudge Report has learned that reporter Michael Isikoff developed the story of his career only to have it spiked by top Newsweek suits hours before publication. A young woman, 23, sexually involved with the love of her life, the President of the United States, since she was a 21-year-old intern at the White House. She was a frequent visitor to a small study just off the Oval Office where she claims to have indulged the president's sexual preference. Reports of the relationship spread in White House quarters, and she was moved to a job at the Pentagon where she worked until last month. The young intern wrote long love letters to President Clinton, which she delivered through a delivery service. She was a frequent visitor at the White House after midnight, where she checked in the wave logs as visiting a secretary named Betty Curry, 57. The Drudge Report has learned that tapes of intimate phone conversations exist. Michael Isikoff was not available for comment late Saturday. Newsweek was on voicemail. The White House was busy checking the Drudge Report for details. I got into bed and stared at the ceiling. "Holy shit," I said. He did it. I was surprised to find a tear running down my face. I turned to Susie, who was lying beside me. "Susie, history just happened," I murmured. "Drudge just changed everything." Chapter 4. Hey, old media. It's not your business model that sucks. It's you that suck. On February 19th, 2010, I spoke at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. The day before I spoke, Kate Zernike of the New York Times reported on another panel at the conference. In particular, she wrote about a young author and investigative journalist named Jason Matera. How can conservatives win the youth vote that overwhelmingly went for Barack Obama in 2008? At the Conservative Political Action Conference, apparently, some are betting on using racial stereotypes. What had Matera done? He mocked what he described with a Chris Rock voice as diversity, including, he said, college classes on cyberfeminism and what it means to be a feminist new black man. Offering up a slogan, he adopted the Chris Rock voice again, "Get your government off my freedom." Except that Matera wasn't doing a Chris Rock impersonation. He was doing a Brooklyn accent because he's from Brooklyn. So when I spoke later that day, I called Zernike out by name. "Kate Zernike of the New York Times, are you in the room? Are you in the room?" You're despicable. You're a despicable human being. Then I said what I really feel about the media. This is what these creeps do. I'm sick of having cocktails with them. I'm now at war with them. No more cocktails. I'm at war with the mainstream media because they portray themselves as objective observers of reality when they're no such thing. They're partisan critical theory hacks who think they can destroy everything America stands for by standing on the sidelines and sniping at patriotic Americans with all their favorite slurs. They have nothing but contempt for the American people. They use all the weapons they have at their disposal to intimidate every one of us and force us to shut up and not to speak our minds. Their days of doing this are over. They're dying because they hate much of America and what it has historically stood for. Then they moan that no one wants to consume their product, saying it's their business model that has just sold them short. Newsflash to the media, it's not your business model that sucks. It's you that suck. My biggest experience yet with the mainstream media came after Drudge broke the Monica Lewinsky story. As much as Lewinsky was a story, the story behind the story was the media's determination to scuttle it as fast as possible. Newsweek had already tried to shut down Isikoff. The Friday before Drudge unleashed the scoop, Newsweek told Isikoff they might not run the story at all. The first signal I got that the story might not go was when I was told we need a backup story on Clinton's Paula Jones deposition in case we don't go with the story, Isikoff said later. Isikoff himself was concerned about the ramifications of releasing the story, since even the single Linda Tripp tape he had in his possession was supposedly ambiguous. It neither confirmed nor undercut the most serious charge, that the president and Vernon Jordan, Clinton's trusted friend and advisor, instructed her to lie. That was the serious federal crime that Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr was investigating. The tape that we heard, which was only one tape, did not prove that. Newsweek's managing editor, Mark Whitaker, blamed killing the story on the fact that the Starr team hadn't yet grilled Lewinsky. Let's say they came back and said, "We talked to her, she denied everything. We believe her." Or they said, "We questioned her, she sounds like a flake, we are dropping the whole investigation." Then we would have been irresponsible to write a wildfire story about sex in the White House. At 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, Editor-in-Chief Richard Smith said that Newsweek was going to hold the story pending further investigation. All of this reeked of Clinton defending, even the tone of the comments. Whitaker characterized the Lewinsky scandal as a story about sex in the White House, which it wasn't. It was a story about the President of the United States committing perjury. Isikoff was acting as though journalistic standards were the same as jury standards, beyond a reasonable doubt, when he could simply have run with the story and let the world know that there were tapes of a White House intern talking about giving the President of the United States blowjobs in the Oval Office. That's a story in itself. The Clinton defending carried over the next morning on ABC's This Week with Sam Donaldson. Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol brought up the story on the panel, freaking out everybody else there. The story in Washington this morning is that Newsweek magazine was going to go with a big story based on tape-recorded conversations, which a woman who was a summer intern at the White House, an intern of Leon Panetta's. Immediately, ABC commentator and former Clinton flack George Stephanopoulos jumped in, stating that the Drudge Report had been discredited. This was a position crafted by the Clinton White House. Stephanopoulos had in fact called up the White House that morning and spoken with John Podesta, Clinton's chief of staff, who told him, "The only way you can respond to it is to say, 'This is Drudge. He's a rumor monger, and you can't believe what you read in the Drudge Report.'" Kristol responded, No. They had screaming arguments in Newsweek magazine yesterday. They finally didn't go with the story. It's going to be a question of whether the media is now going to report what are pretty well-validated charges of presidential behavior in the White House, at which point Sam Donaldson intervened and said that he didn't think anyone should comment on the Drudge Report story until Newsweek had a chance to explain why it killed the story. It was typical baffling with bullshit from the Democrat media complex. Stephanopoulos, by the way, has now been rewarded by ABC News, his employer, with the false label of a neutral, objective reporter, not once, but twice, for thwarting legitimate stories. Early in the 1990s, Stephanopoulos acted to prevent the #1 New York Times best-selling author Gary Aldrich from talking about what life was like coordinating FBI efforts to vet employees under Clinton. Aldrich basically said it was like trying to vet a druggy fraternity house, a test I would have failed, but then no sane person would have nominated me. Sam Donaldson was saying it wasn't even worth discussing until Newsweek got a chance to explain itself. The Democrat media complex protects its own, and in the case of Stephanopoulos, it rewards former political hacks with journalistic firewall status. They get to pretend to be independent-minded people while actually acting as barbed wire fences protecting their masters from insurgent campaigns from the right. With This Week, the blackout had begun. Doyle McManus, Washington bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times, said, "I looked at the Drudge Report and thought, if Isikoff wants to pursue that story, he's welcome to it." On CBS's Face the Nation and NBC's Meet the Press, lawyers appeared to talk about Paula Jones's legal strategy, and nobody mentioned the Drudge story. Tim Russert refused to touch it because there's not enough there. He asked James Carville, Clinton's attack dog, whether there was a pattern of behavior that those who support President Clinton are worried about, then allowed Carville to respond without rebuttal, "The president denies it, and, frankly, I know the president's telling the truth." That evening on CNN, the lead story was Clinton sexually harassing Kathleen Willey, a story that was 6 months old. Carol Simpson on ABC's World News Tonight led off with the story that Paula Jones was skipping out of D.C. Sam Donaldson, the Clinton defender, spun the Clinton deposition as a Clinton win, somberly intoning, "Behind the scenes, the spinning of the story continued. Paula Jones and her group dined Saturday night with champagne, professing to be pleased with the way things had gone. Friends of the president one-upped that by telling Time magazine the Clinton camp is ecstatic about the way the deposition went." The media ran from the story in one mass stampede. And the next night, at 11:52, Drudge released Lewinsky's name. And for the next day and a half, the media maintained their silence. Finally, on Wednesday morning, perhaps sensing that with the name out there the dam would burst soon, the Washington Post ran a story. The Los Angeles Times followed suit. At 8 p.m. on Wednesday night, Michael Isikoff's 4,000-word piece on the Lewinsky scandal posted at Newsweek's website, or rather, at the AOL website, since Newsweek still didn't have its own website. By the time the media finally broke their blackout, it had been all day Sunday, all day Monday, and all day Tuesday. That was 4 days of the story existing in the undermedia, the internet and talk radio, and Drudge reporting on the story one bit at a time, giving more and more evidence, messaging, "We've got the goods." Even as the media were finally starting to recognize the story, Drudge was breaking new ground. That Wednesday he ran a headline, "Report: Lewinsky offered UN job. Investigators: DNA trail may exist." And just to stick the knife in, he added the notation, "contains graphic descriptions." The report revealed that investigators have become convinced that there may be a DNA trail that could confirm President Clinton's sexual involvement with Lewinsky. Tripp has shared with investigators a conversation where Lewinsky allegedly confided that she kept a garment with Clinton's dried semen on it, a garment she said she would never wash. It was a media frenzy by now. 4 days after the story broke, and after thinking the story had been killed by George Stephanopoulos, Hillary Clinton had to appear with Matt Lauer on the Today Show to try to put the scandal to rest. On January 27, 1998, an unnaturally balanced Matt Lauer grilled Hillary Clinton over her husband's reported indiscretions. First, she blamed the vast right-wing conspiracy to get her husband. Lauer asked her whether the charges came as big a shock to you as anyone. The rest was history. Hillary. And to my husband. I mean, he woke me up Wednesday morning and said, "You're not going to believe this." Lauer. And so when people say there's a lot of smoke here, your message is, where there's smoke. Hillary. There isn't any fire.